The next morning, Marcus woke up feeling pleased with himself. The evening with Sarah had gone better than he could have hoped. He had impressed her with his stories, and she seemed genuinely interested in both his supposed military experience and him personally. He found himself looking forward to potentially seeing her again. Marcus checked his phone while getting dressed for the final day of the conference. There was a message from the conference organizers about a special presentation that had been added to the schedule. Something about real combat aviation experiences. Marcus deleted it without reading the full details, more interested in his coffee and the possibility of running into Sarah again. The conference hall was busier than usual for the final morning. Marcus grabbed his coffee and continental breakfast, scanning the crowd for Sarah's auburn hair and navy blazer. He spotted several people he had met over the past few days and made small talk, but part of his attention was always searching for her. "Ladies and gentlemen," the conference moderator announced from the main stage, "we have a special addition to today's program. We're honored to have a distinguished military aviator who will be sharing real experiences from combat operations. Please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell." Marcus nearly choked on his coffee. Sarah walked onto the stage, but she looked completely different from the woman he had spent the evening with. She was wearing a crisp Air Force dress uniform decorated with numerous ribbons and medals. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation style, and her entire demeanor radiated military professionalism. "Thank you for having me," Sarah said into the microphone, her voice carrying the same confidence Marcus remembered, but now with an unmistakable tone of authority. "I'm here to talk about the realities of combat aviation, based on my 15 years of active duty service." Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. This wasn't just someone interested in aviation. This was a real military pilot, a real combat veteran, and he had spent the entire evening lying to her about experiences she actually had. "I flew F-16 Fighting Falcons for over a decade," Sarah continued, and Marcus felt his face burning with embarrassment. "Including multiple combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. The aircraft we call the Viper in operational circles." The irony hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had used the call sign Maverick and bragged about flying the very aircraft this woman had actually flown in real combat. Every detail he had fabricated, she had lived through for real. Sarah began her presentation with technical details about F-16 capabilities, and Marcus recognized much of the information he had regurgitated to her the night before. Except when she said it, it came with the weight of genuine experience. She talked about actual weapon systems she had used, real missions she had flown, and the true emotional cost of combat operations. "Combat aviation isn't glamorous," Sarah said, her eyes scanning the audience. "It's not like the movies. It's about precision, training, and making life-or-death decisions while under extreme stress. Every mission carries real consequences for real people." Marcus slumped deeper into his seat, hoping she wouldn't spot him in the crowd. But even as he tried to hide, he found himself genuinely fascinated by her presentation. This was what real combat flying actually looked like, not the fabricated adventure stories he had been telling. "One of the most challenging aspects of combat aviation is the responsibility you carry," Sarah continued. "When you're providing close air support for ground troops, their lives literally depend on your accuracy and judgment. There's no room for error." She described a mission remarkably similar to one of the stories Marcus had told her, except her version carried the weight of genuine emotion and real consequence. She talked about the stress, the fear, and the professional satisfaction of successfully completing missions that saved lives. "People often ask about the emotional toll," Sarah said. "How do you handle taking lives? How do you deal with seeing friends and colleagues killed in action? These aren't questions you can answer with bravado or tough guy stories. They require honest reflection about what it means to serve in combat." Marcus realized that every story he had told the night before was a shallow parody of real experiences this woman had actually lived through. He had turned genuine sacrifice and service into entertainment, and he had done it to impress the very person who had actually made those sacrifices. "The camaraderie among combat pilots is real," Sarah continued, "but it's forged through shared danger and mutual dependence, not through boasting or war stories. We look out for each other because we understand the stakes in ways that can't be communicated to those who haven't been there." During a break in the presentation, Marcus considered leaving the conference early. The embarrassment was overwhelming, and he couldn't imagine facing Sarah after what had happened. But something kept him in his seat, perhaps a masochistic need to hear what real combat aviation was actually like. When Sarah resumed her presentation, she talked about transitioning from military to civilian aviation. Many combat veterans struggle with the adjustment, she said. Commercial flying can feel mundane after the intensity of combat operations, but there's also relief in flying missions where the goal is simply to transport people safely to their destinations. Marcus thought about his own comfortable job flying commercial routes. He had never experienced the stress and responsibility Sarah was describing, yet he had pretended to miss it the night before. I want to address something that concerns me about civilian aviation culture, Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious. There's sometimes a tendency to romanticize military service and combat operations. People tell war stories that aren't theirs, or embellish their actual service to sound more impressive. Marcus felt like she was speaking directly to him, even though she was addressing the entire audience. This does a disservice to those who actually served in combat, Sarah continued. Real military experience comes with real costs. When people appropriate those experiences for their own benefit, it diminishes the sacrifices made by actual service members. The audience was completely silent, and Marcus wondered if others were also feeling the weight of her words. I've encountered this personally, Sarah said, and Marcus's blood ran cold. Just last night, in fact, I met someone who claimed extensive combat experience in the same aircraft I actually flew in combat. It was educational to hear his version of experiences I actually lived through. Marcus wanted to disappear. He knew with absolute certainty that she was talking about him, and he suspected that at least some people in the audience might put the pieces together. The real tragedy, Sarah concluded, is that honest civilian aviation experience has its own value and dignity. There's no need to embellish or fabricate military service to be impressive or interesting. Commercial aviation serves a vital function, and those who do it well deserve respect for their actual accomplishments. As Sarah finished her presentation to enthusiastic applause, Marcus sat frozen in his seat, finally understanding the full scope of his humiliation. After Sarah's presentation ended, Marcus sat paralyzed in his chair as conference attendees filed out around him. The applause had been thunderous, and he had watched several people approach the stage to speak with Sarah personally. Meanwhile, he remained frozen, wrestling with the magnitude of his humiliation. He finally forced himself to stand when the conference hall was nearly empty, but instead of leaving, he found himself walking toward the stage. He wasn't sure what he planned to say, but he knew he couldn't just disappear without acknowledging what had happened. Sarah was packing up her presentation materials when she noticed him approaching. Her expression was unreadable as she watched him walk up the steps to the stage platform. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, Marcus said awkwardly, not sure how to begin. You can call me Sarah, she replied calmly. We're past formalities at this point, don't you think? Marcus took a deep breath. I owe you an apology. A huge apology. Sarah finished packing her laptop and turned to face him fully. I'm listening. Everything I told you last night was a lie, Marcus said, the words coming out in a rush. I never flew combat missions. I was in the Air Force for 4 years, but I flew transport planes on domestic routes. I never saw combat, never deployed overseas, never did any of the things I claimed. Sarah nodded slowly. I know. You knew? Marcus asked, surprised. I suspected early on, but I became certain when you said your call sign was Maverick, Sarah explained. No real military pilot would use a call sign from a movie. Plus, some of your technical details were off, and your stories had a Hollywood quality that real combat experiences don't have. Marcus felt even worse knowing that she had been aware of his lies throughout their conversation. Then why did you keep listening? Why did you encourage me to keep talking? Sarah leaned against the podium, considering her answer. Partly curiosity. I wanted to see how far you would take it. But mostly I was trying to understand why someone would feel the need to fabricate military service. I don't know why, Marcus admitted. I guess I wanted to seem more interesting, more impressive. Commercial flying feels ordinary compared to what you've actually done. That's where you're wrong, Sarah said firmly. Commercial aviation is incredibly important work. You transport hundreds of people safely every day. You've probably never lost a passenger, never had a serious accident. That's not ordinary, that's exceptional. Marcus hadn't expected this response. But it's not exciting like combat flying. Marcus, do you know what I missed most during my combat deployments? Sarah asked. Routine flights where nobody was shooting at me. Flights where the biggest concern was weather delays, not enemy fire. There's tremendous value in boring, safe aviation. They were silent for a moment as Marcus processed this perspective. I need to ask you something, Sarah continued. Have you told these stories before? To other people? Marcus hesitated, then nodded. Yes, not the specific details, but I've implied that my military service was more extensive than it actually was. That has to stop, Sarah said, her tone becoming more serious. It's not just embarrassing for you. It's disrespectful to actual veterans, and it spreads misconceptions about what military service really involves. I know that now, Marcus said. After listening to your presentation, I understand how wrong I was. Your real experiences made my fake stories seem like cheap entertainment. Sarah studied his face carefully. I believe you're genuinely remorseful. But the question is, what are you going to do about it? What do you mean? Well, you can't take back the lies you've told, but you can commit to being honest going forward, Sarah explained. And more than that, you can use this experience to develop a real understanding of military service instead of the fantasy version you've been promoting. Marcus nodded eagerly. How can I do that? Start by learning about actual military aviation, Sarah suggested. Read memoirs by real combat pilots. Understand the history and reality of military service. If you're genuinely interested in this subject, approach it with the respect it deserves. I will, Marcus promised. But I have to ask, why are you being so understanding about this? You could have humiliated me publicly. You could have called me out during your presentation. Sarah smiled slightly. I could have. And honestly, part of me wanted to, but I've learned that humiliation rarely changes behavior for the better. You're clearly embarrassed enough as it is. More than embarrassed, Marcus admitted. I feel sick about the whole thing. Good, Sarah said. That means you understand the gravity of what you did. Now the question is whether you'll learn from it or just feel bad about it. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Can I ask you something personal? You can ask. What was combat actually like? Not the technical details, but emotionally. Sarah considered the question carefully. Terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. But mostly it was about duty and responsibility. Every mission mattered because real lives were at stake. That weight never leaves you, even years later. Do you regret it? No, Sarah said without hesitation. But I don't romanticize it either. It was a job that needed to be done, and I was trained to do it. The real heroism isn't in the flying. It's in the commitment to serve something larger than yourself. Marcus felt a deep sense of shame as he realized how his lies had trivialized this commitment. I'm truly sorry, Sarah. Not just for lying to you, but for cheapening what you and others like you have actually done. Apology accepted, Sarah said. But here's what I want from you going forward. When people ask about your military service, tell them the truth. Transport flying is honorable work too, and if you encounter other people telling fake war stories, consider speaking up. I will, Marcus promised. Sarah gathered her things and prepared to leave. You know, Marcus, you seem like a decent person who made a bad choice. Don't let this mistake define you, but don't forget the lesson either. As she walked away, Marcus remained on the stage, finally understanding the difference between real service and the fantasy version he had been selling. For the first time in years, he felt motivated to be genuinely proud of his actual accomplishments rather than seeking validation through fabricated heroics. The conference hall was now completely empty except for cleaning staff preparing for the next event. Marcus stood alone, processing everything that had happened and beginning to plan how he would change his behavior going forward. 3 months after the conference, Marcus sat in his apartment reading Viper Pilot by Dan Hampton, one of several memoirs by actual F-16 combat pilots that Sarah had recommended. The book painted a vivid and honest picture of what combat aviation really involved, and Marcus found himself both fascinated and humbled by the authentic accounts. His reading was interrupted by his phone buzzing with a text from his colleague Jake, who was hosting a barbecue that afternoon. Marcus had been dreading social gatherings lately because they often led to conversations about military service, and he was still learning how to navigate those discussions honestly. At the barbecue, Marcus found himself in a familiar situation. Jake was introducing him to some neighbors, and the conversation naturally turned to careers and backgrounds. Marcus here is a pilot, Jake announced proudly. Used to be in the military too. Tell them about some of your experiences, Marcus. In the past, This would have been Marcus's cue to launch into fabricated stories about combat missions and heroic adventures. Instead, he felt his stomach tighten as he searched for the right words. "I was in the Air Force for 4 years," Marcus said carefully. "I flew transport planes, mostly moving supplies and personnel between domestic bases. It was good experience that helped me transition to commercial aviation." One of the neighbors, a man named Robert, leaned forward with interest. "That's cool, but did you ever see any action? Any overseas deployments?" "No," Marcus replied honestly. "My service was entirely domestic. Transport flying isn't as exciting as combat aviation, but it taught me a lot about aircraft systems and aviation safety." Marcus could see the slight disappointment in Robert's expression, and he felt the familiar urge to embellish his story, but he forced himself to stay honest, remembering Sarah's words about the value of truthful service. "Still pretty impressive," Jake said supportively. "Not everyone has the skills to fly military aircraft." The conversation moved on to other topics, and Marcus felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. The relief came from not having to maintain elaborate lies, but he couldn't deny missing the attention and admiration that his fake war stories used to generate. Later that evening, Marcus was surprised to receive an email from Sarah. They had stayed in touch sporadically since the conference, mainly sharing articles about aviation safety and military history. "Hi, Marcus," her email read. "I hope you don't mind me reaching out, but I wanted to share something with you. I'm organizing a panel discussion for next month's Veterans Aviation Forum about transitioning from military to civilian aviation careers. We're looking for perspectives from both combat and non-combat veterans. Would you be interested in participating?" Marcus read the email twice, unsure how to respond. The idea of speaking publicly about his military experience terrified him, especially in front of actual veterans. He called Sarah the next day. "I got your email about the panel discussion," he said. "I'm honored that you thought of me, but I'm not sure I belong on a panel with real veterans." "What do you mean by real veterans?" Sarah asked pointedly. "You know what I mean. People who actually deployed, who actually served in important roles." "Marcus, you served in the Air Force for 4 years," Sarah said firmly. "You contributed to military operations even if you weren't in combat. Transport aviation is essential to military readiness. Without people doing your job, combat operations couldn't happen." Marcus hadn't thought about it that way before. "But my experience seems so ordinary compared to what you've been through." "That's exactly why we need your perspective," Sarah explained. "Most military aviation careers are like yours, not like mine. We need to show young people considering military service that there are many ways to serve meaningfully, not just the Hollywood version of combat aviation." After much internal debate, Marcus agreed to participate in the panel. The weeks leading up to the event were filled with anxiety as he prepared to speak honestly about his actual military experience for the first time in years. The Veterans Aviation Forum was smaller and more intimate than the conference where he had first met Sarah. The audience consisted mainly of veterans, current military personnel, and young people considering military careers. Marcus sat on the panel alongside Sarah, a helicopter pilot who had served in Iraq, and a maintenance officer who had spent 20 years keeping aircraft operational. He felt intimidated by their extensive service records, but Sarah had coached him to focus on his own genuine experiences, rather than comparing himself to others. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he took a deep breath and began. "My name is Marcus Thompson, and I served as a transport pilot in the Air Force for 4 years. I never deployed overseas, never flew combat missions, and honestly, for a long time I felt like my service wasn't important enough to talk about." He could see some audience members nodding in recognition, and he realized that many of them probably had similar feelings about their own non-combat service. "But I've learned that every role in military aviation matters," Marcus continued. "The flights I made moving personnel and supplies might not have been glamorous, but they were necessary. Military operations depend on logistics, on getting the right people and equipment to the right places at the right times." Marcus talked about the technical skills he had learned, the teamwork required for successful missions, and the pride he felt in contributing to military readiness. For the first time, he focused on what he had actually accomplished rather than what he wished he had done. During the question and answer period, a young woman in the audience asked, "Do you feel like your non-combat service prepared you well for civilian aviation?" "Absolutely," Marcus replied. Military aviation taught me precision, attention to detail, and the importance of following procedures exactly. Those skills translate directly to commercial aviation, where safety is the top priority. After the panel, several audience members approached Marcus to thank him for his honest perspective. A young man considering military service said that Marcus's presentation had helped him understand that there were meaningful ways to serve, even if he wasn't interested in combat roles. Sarah walked up to Marcus as the event was ending. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Good," Marcus replied, somewhat surprised by his own answer. "Really good, actually. Better than I've felt after talking about my military experience in years." "That's what honesty feels like," Sarah said with a smile. "You should be proud of what you actually accomplished, not ashamed that it wasn't something else." As Marcus drove home that evening, he reflected on how much had changed since that embarrassing night at the conference. He was finally learning to value his real experiences and accomplishments, and he was discovering that authenticity felt much better than the temporary validation that had come from his lies. For the first time in years, Marcus felt genuinely proud of his military service, not because he had fabricated heroic stories about it, but because he had finally learned to appreciate what he had actually contributed. 1 year after the conference that had changed his perspective, Marcus found himself back at another aviation industry event. This time, however, he approached conversations with a completely different mindset. He had spent the past year learning to appreciate his actual accomplishments and had become an advocate for honest military service narratives. Marcus was presenting his own workshop this time, titled "The Value of Support Aviation: Lessons from Transport Operations." The room was filled with both military and civilian aviation professionals, and he felt confident in a way that was entirely different from the false bravado he used to rely on. Military aviation isn't just about fighter jets and combat missions, Marcus began his presentation. For every combat pilot, there are dozens of support personnel making those missions possible. Transport pilots, maintenance crews, air traffic controllers, logistics coordinators. We all play vital roles in military readiness. He spoke about the technical challenges of transport aviation, the importance of precision in cargo loading and weight distribution, and the critical nature of delivering personnel and supplies on time. His presentation was based entirely on his real experiences, and the authenticity resonated with the audience. During the break, a young Air Force lieutenant approached him. "Thank you for that presentation," she said. "I'm currently flying transport missions, and sometimes I feel like my job isn't as important as what the fighter pilots do." "I used to feel exactly the same way," Marcus replied honestly. "It took me years to realize that importance isn't measured by how dangerous or exciting your job is, but by how well you execute your mission and contribute to the larger objective." They talked for several more minutes about the challenges and rewards of transport aviation. Marcus found genuine satisfaction in encouraging this young officer to take pride in her actual service rather than wishing for something different. Later that afternoon, Marcus was surprised to see Sarah enter the conference hall. She was in civilian clothes this time, having recently transitioned from active duty to working for a defense contractor. "I heard about your workshop," Sarah said, approaching him during another break. "I'm impressed. This is quite a change from the Marcus I met a year ago." "I've learned a lot since then," Marcus replied, "mostly thanks to the wake-up call you gave me." "You did the hard work," Sarah said. "I just pointed out what you probably already knew deep down." They found seats in a quiet corner of the conference hall and caught up on the past year. Sarah told him about her transition to civilian work and her ongoing efforts to mentor young military aviators. Marcus shared his experiences speaking at veteran events and his growing involvement with organizations that supported transitioning military personnel. "I have to tell you something," Marcus said. "A few months ago, I encountered someone at a different conference who was telling fake war stories. Stories very similar to the ones I used to tell." "What did you do?" Sarah asked. "I talked to him privately the way you talked to me," Marcus explained. "I told him about my own experience with fabricating military service and how it had backfired." "I think I got through to him," Sarah smiled. "That's exactly what needs to happen. Veterans helping other veterans understand the value of honest service." As the conference continued, Marcus noticed something that never would have occurred to him a year earlier. There were many attendees like him, People with genuine military experience who seemed uncomfortable talking about it because their service didn't match the Hollywood version of military heroics. During the networking dinner that evening, Marcus made an effort to connect with these individuals. He talked with a former Navy mechanic who had kept aircraft operational on carrier deployments, an Air Force air traffic controller who had managed busy military airfields, and a Coast Guard pilot who had conducted search and rescue operations. "You know what I've noticed?" Marcus said to the group that had gathered around their table. "We all have valuable military experience, but we tend to downplay it because it doesn't match what people expect military service to look like." The Navy mechanic nodded. "People always want to hear about combat, but my job was making sure aircraft were safe to fly. That seems boring compared to war stories." "But without you, there wouldn't be any war stories," Marcus replied. "Combat operations depend entirely on maintenance and logistics. Your work probably saved more lives than any individual combat mission." The conversation continued throughout the evening, with each person sharing their real experiences and gradually understanding the importance of their actual contributions. Marcus realized that his year-long journey from fabricated heroics to authentic pride had led him to this moment, helping others recognize the value of their genuine service. A week after the conference, Marcus received an email that surprised him. It was from the young Air Force lieutenant he had spoken with during his workshop. "Mr. Thompson," the email read, "I wanted to thank you again for our conversation. I've been thinking about what you said about measuring importance by mission execution rather than excitement level. I've started a small group at my base for transport and support personnel to share experiences and learn from each other. Would you be willing to speak to our group via video conference sometime?" Marcus immediately replied that he would be honored to participate. Over the following months, he found himself regularly speaking to military groups about the importance of honest service narratives and the value of support roles in military operations. 6 months later, Marcus was invited to be a keynote speaker at a major veterans conference. As he prepared his presentation, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had transformed from someone who fabricated military heroics to impress strangers into someone who genuinely helped other veterans appreciate their real contributions. The night before his keynote speech, Marcus called Sarah to thank her one final time for the intervention that had changed his life. "You know what the best part is?" Marcus told her. "I actually feel proud of my military service now. Not because I've convinced myself it was something it wasn't, but because I finally understand what it actually was." "That's what I hoped would happen," Sarah replied. "Real pride is much more satisfying than fake admiration." As Marcus delivered his keynote speech the next day, he looked out at an audience filled with veterans from all branches of service and all types of military occupations. He spoke about the dangers of stolen valor, the importance of honest service narratives, and the vital contributions made by every person who serves, regardless of their specific role. "Military service comes in many forms," Marcus concluded his speech. "Some serve in combat, others in support roles. Some deploy overseas, others serve domestically. But every person who puts on the uniform and commits to serving something larger than themselves deserves respect for their actual contribution, not judgment for what their service wasn't." The standing ovation that followed was the most satisfying recognition Marcus had ever received, because for the first time in his life he had earned it honestly. The silence that followed Davidson's announcement stretched like a held breath. Maya stood in the center of the mat, her chest rising and falling steadily while Marcus remained crumpled near the edge, his pride as bruised as his body. The watching students seemed frozen, their understanding of the academy's hierarchy completely shattered in the span of a few devastating minutes. Then the whispers began, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. "Did you see how fast she moved? She lifted him like he weighed nothing." Those weren't academy techniques. Maya heard every word, but her attention was focused on Instructor Davidson, who was studying her with the intense gaze of a man reassessing everything he thought he knew. Behind him, the other senior instructors were having a hushed conversation, their expressions grave. "Wilson," Davidson called. "A word." Maya followed him to the side of the training hall, aware that every eye in the room was tracking her movement. The students who had dismissed her 6 months ago were now looking at her like she was a dangerous animal that had somehow learned to wear a uniform. "That was quite a performance," Davidson said quietly, his voice carrying no trace of the respect or admiration that usually followed such decisive victories. Instead, there was something that sounded like concern, perhaps even suspicion. Care to explain how a scholarship student with no formal training just dismantled one of our top cadets? Maya met his gaze steadily. You said you wanted to see what we were made of. Don't play games with me, Wilson. What I just witnessed wasn't self-defense training or natural talent. That was combat experience. Real combat experience. His voice dropped even lower. The kind that leaves marks. Maya's hand moved unconsciously toward her sleeve, then stopped. The gesture wasn't lost on Davidson, whose sharp eyes caught everything. Show me, he said. Sir? Your arms. Show me your arms. The request hit Maya like a physical blow. She had spent so much energy hiding those marks, creating elaborate stories to explain away glimpses of scars, wearing long sleeves even in the academy's heated facilities. Now, with the entire student body watching from across the hall, Davidson was asking her to reveal the roadmap of violence that decorated her skin. I don't think that wasn't a request. Cadet. Maya looked around the training hall, at the faces that had ignored her for months but were now hanging on her every movement. Sarah stood near the back, her expression worried but supportive. Elena, still nursing her injured arm, watched with something that might have been recognition. Marcus had finally managed to sit up, his face a mixture of humiliation and confusion. Slowly, Maya began rolling up her left sleeve. The first scar that emerged was relatively small, a thin white line that ran from her wrist toward her elbow. But as more fabric was pushed back, the true extent of the damage became visible. Long, jagged marks that spoke of knife wounds, circular burns that could only have come from cigarettes. The twisted rope of scar tissue around her wrist that Sarah had glimpsed the night before. A collective gasp went up from the watching students. Some turned away, unable to look at the evidence of violence that contradicted everything they thought they knew about the world. Others stared in horrified fascination, finally understanding that the quiet girl they had dismissed carried battle scars that dwarfed anything they might earn in their carefully controlled training exercises. Maya rolled up her right sleeve as well, revealing similar damage. Each mark told a story of survival, of moments when running hadn't been an option, of nights when the choice was between fighting back or not seeing morning. The scars were ugly, brutal reminders of a world that existed beyond the academy's protected walls. Sweet Jesus, one of the instructors breathed. Davidson studied the revealed damage with the clinical eye of someone who had seen combat wounds before. How old were you when you got these? The first one was from when I was 12, Maya said, indicating the mark around her wrist. Some men thought I'd be easy to grab. They were wrong. And the others? Maya traced a particularly vicious scar that ran along her forearm. 13, 14, 15. Various people who made the same mistake as those first men. Her voice was steady, matter of fact, as if she were reciting a grocery list rather than cataloging years of violence. You learn fast on the streets, instructor. You learn that there's no such thing as a fair fight when your life is on the line. The training hall had gone completely silent now. Even Marcus had stopped nursing his wounded pride, staring at Maya's arms with an expression that suggested he was finally beginning to understand exactly what he had challenged. Elena stepped forward from the crowd, her voice carrying clearly in the silence. That's why you moved differently than everyone else. You weren't fighting for points or pride. You were fighting like... She paused, searching for the right words. Like my life depended on it, Maya finished. Because for most of my life it did. Davidson looked around the hall, taking in the stunned faces of students who were confronting a reality they had never imagined. Everyone out, he ordered. Training's over for today. Instructors remain behind. As the students filed out in unusual quiet, Maya began rolling her sleeves back down, covering the evidence of her past. But the damage was done, or perhaps finally revealed. The careful facade she had maintained for 6 months lay in ruins, just like Marcus's reputation as an unbeatable fighter. Wilson, Davidson said once the hall had emptied except for the instructors, I need to know everything. Your real background, how you learned to fight, what you've been hiding since you got here. Maya looked at the men who had spent months training her in techniques she had already mastered through necessity, who had been preparing her for conflicts that seemed like games compared to what she had already survived. These instructors, with their military experience and formal training, suddenly seemed very young to her despite their gray hair and weathered faces. I told you that I was good at adapting to situations, she said. What I didn't tell you was that I spent years in situations where adaptation wasn't optional. It was survival. One of the other instructors, Commander Walsh, stepped forward. The background check we ran on you came back clean. No criminal record, no history of violence. Because nobody ever reported what happened to me, Maya replied. When you live in a world where the police don't come when you call, where social services are overwhelmed, where the strong prey on the weak as a matter of course, you learn to handle your own problems. And you learn not to trust authorities who ask questions but never provide answers. Davidson rubbed his jaw. A gesture Maya had learned meant he was processing difficult information. So when you applied for this scholarship, I wanted out. I wanted to become something more than a street fighter. I thought if I could prove myself here, I could leave all that behind and become a real warrior, someone who fought for justice instead of survival. But you've been holding back, Maya nodded. I didn't want anyone to know what I really was. I thought if I could just blend in, learn your techniques, graduate with decent marks, maybe I could reinvent myself completely. But some things, she gestured toward her concealed arms. Some things don't stay hidden forever. Commander Walsh and the other instructors exchanged glances that Maya couldn't interpret. Finally, Davidson spoke again. Wilson, what you've shown us today changes things. Changes everything. You're not just another cadet anymore. You're evidence that our training methods, our understanding of what makes a warrior, might be incomplete. Maya felt a chill run down her spine. What does that mean? Davidson's expression was grave when he answered. It means we need to decide whether you're an asset to be developed or a problem to be solved. And I'm not sure which would be better for you. 3 days passed in an uncomfortable limbo. Maya had been excused from regular classes while the academy administration decided her fate, leaving her to wander the grounds like a ghost haunting her former life. Students who had previously ignored her now watched her with a mixture of fear and fascination, stepping aside when she passed, their conversations dying until she was safely out of earshot. The tournament was only 2 weeks away, but Maya's name had been quietly removed from the participant list. No explanation was given, but everyone understood what it meant. The academy was distancing itself from her, treating her like a dangerous variable that didn't fit into their carefully ordered world. Maya sat in the library, surrounded by books on military strategy and combat theory, but her mind was elsewhere. Through the tall windows, she could see other students practicing on the outdoor training grounds, their movements precise and choreographed. Everything about the academy was designed to create warriors who fought within rules, who operated within systems, who understood that violence was a tool to be applied with precision and restraint. She had never had that luxury. You look like someone planning an escape, a voice said behind her. Maya turned to find Elena approaching, her arm still in its sling, but her expression more open than it had ever been. She pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited, studying Maya with the same intensity she might apply to a particularly challenging tactical problem. Maybe I am, Maya admitted. It's pretty clear I don't belong here. Elena leaned back, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her injured shoulder. You know what's funny? 6 months ago, I would have agreed with that. You were quiet, mediocre, forgettable. I figured you were just another scholarship kid who'd wash out before graduation. And now? Now I think you might be the only one of us who actually understands what being a warrior means. Maya looked up from her book, surprised by the sincerity in Elena's voice. I'm not a warrior. Warriors fight for causes, for principles, for something bigger than themselves. I just fought to survive. Elena shook her head. You think those are different things? You think survival isn't a cause worth fighting for? She gestured toward the window where their fellow students continued their practice drills. Look at them. Look at Marcus if he ever shows his face in public again. They're playing at war, Maya. They're training to fight enemies they've never met, in conflicts they don't understand, using techniques designed to minimize casualties and maximize tactical advantage. That sounds like good training to me. It would be, if they were preparing for the right kind of war. Elena leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. But what happens when they face someone like you? Someone who learned to fight where there are no rules, no referees, no safety nets? What happens when clean technique meets desperate survival? Maya thought about her match with Marcus, how his textbook movements had seemed almost comically slow and predictable compared to the chaotic violence she had learned to navigate. They lose, exactly. And that's why the instructors are terrified of you. You represent something they can't control or predict. You're proof that their methods might not be enough when it really matters. Before Maya could respond, Instructor Davidson appeared beside their table. His expression was carefully neutral, but Maya could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "Wilson, you're needed in the administration building, immediately." Maya stood, her stomach clenching with anxiety. Elena caught her arm as she passed, the contact gentle despite the strength Maya knew was hidden in the other woman's grip. "Whatever they decide," Elena said quietly, "remember that strength isn't something to be ashamed of, even when it comes from dark places." The walk to the administration building felt like a journey to her own execution. Davidson said nothing, but Maya could sense his internal conflict. He was a man who valued excellence, who respected capability, but who also understood that institutions had rules for reasons. Maya represented a problem that couldn't be solved by traditional methods. The administration office was larger than any room Maya had seen in the academy, its walls lined with portraits of distinguished graduates and plaques commemorating various achievements. Behind an imposing oak desk sat Director Harrison, a woman whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her ruthless efficiency. Beside her stood Commander Walsh and two other officials Maya didn't recognize. "Sit down, Cadet Wilson," Director Harrison said, her voice professionally pleasant, but carrying an undertone that suggested this was not a social visit. Maya took the indicated chair, keeping her posture straight and her hands folded in her lap. Years of dealing with authority figures had taught her that showing weakness in these moments was invariably a mistake. "I'll be direct," the director continued. "Your performance in recent training exercises has raised significant questions about your background and suitability for continued enrollment at this academy." Maya had been expecting this, but the words still hit like a physical blow. "I've maintained passing grades in all my classes. Grades that, we now realize, represent a significant underestimation of your actual capabilities." Commander Walsh pulled out a tablet and scrolled through what Maya assumed was her file. "We've been investigating your background more thoroughly since your demonstration with Cadet Marcus." Maya's blood went cold. "Investigation? We've spoken with social services in your home city. We've reviewed police reports from your neighborhood. We've pieced together a picture of your life before the academy that bears very little resemblance to your application materials." The director leaned forward, her eyes never leaving Maya's face. "You've been involved in at least 12 documented altercations with adult criminals, most of them significantly larger and more experienced than yourself. In each case, you emerged victorious while your opponents required medical attention. That's not self-defense, Cadet Wilson. That's a pattern of extreme violence." Maya felt the familiar burn starting behind her scars, the same fire that had kept her alive when diplomacy wasn't an option. "They attacked me first, every single time." "We're not questioning the legitimacy of your actions," Commander Walsh interjected. "We're questioning whether someone with your history can be integrated into a structured military environment." One of the officials Maya didn't recognize spoke for the first time. "There's also the matter of concealed information on your application. The omissions about your past could be grounds for immediate dismissal." Maya looked around the room at the faces of people who had never known hunger, never slept in doorways, never been forced to choose between violence and victimhood. They were trying to judge her by standards that applied to a world they had never experienced. "So what happens now?" she asked quietly. Director Harrison exchanged glances with her colleagues before answering. "We're prepared to offer you a choice. You can accept voluntary withdrawal from the academy with no mark on your record, allowing you to pursue other educational opportunities, or—" She paused, and Maya could sense that whatever came next would change everything. "Or you can remain enrolled under a specialized training program designed specifically for individuals with your unique background. You would work directly with advanced instructors, focus on channeling your abilities into legitimate military applications, and serve as a case study for developing new training methodologies." Maya stared at her. "You want to study me. We want to understand you," Commander Walsh corrected. "Your capabilities represent something we haven't encountered before. Traditional training produces competent soldiers. But you might be something different entirely." Maya thought about Elena's words, about the look of recognition in her eyes when she had finally seen Maya fight without holding back. She thought about Sarah's acceptance despite the scars, about the students who had dismissed her but who now watched her with wary respect. Most of all, she thought about the girl she had been before the world showed her its teeth. Innocent, trusting, believing that strength meant never having to hurt anyone. That girl was gone, lost in alleyways and back rooms where survival trumped morality. But maybe, just maybe, she could become something better than either the victim she had started as, or the weapon she had been forced to become. If I agree to this program, Maya said slowly, what exactly would I be training for? Director Harrison smiled, and for the first time since Maya had entered the office, the expression seemed genuine. To become the kind of warrior the world actually needs, instead of the kind we've been pretending to create. Maya looked down at her hands, at the sleeves that covered scars earned in battles no one else in this room could imagine. Her scars had told their story finally and completely. Now it was time to write a new chapter. When do I start?